Record. All right, so we are recording again. So what we wanted to do here today was
Welcome to the cult of conversation.
Yes, we should extend the welcome. That's important. So we didn't finish up the little section that Pinker has between his preface and his first chapter. There's a few about a page and a half or two that we need to finish up. But also, we didn't touch on the preface, which is very brief and actually is mostly acknowledgments and what have you. Yeah, it's
the large part of it is.
Yeah. But the very first two paragraphs are, we think, important, and really make it clear that this book is quite overtly political. I suspect it's going to become more clear as time goes on, but he sort of lays it out right here. So, and you've got this up on the screen here. So, do you want to go ahead and read that first paragraph?
Yeah. Why don't I take on the? I'll just read the first paragraph. We'll do one paragraph at a time. And
Yeah. I mean, this is mostly quotes. So.
Yeah, this is a quote. We're just going to take a close look at. Hang on a second here.
What's going on with this motive?
Yeah. All right. So the second half of the second decade of the third millennium would not seem to be an auspicious time to publish a book on the historical sweep of progress and its causes. At the time of this writing, my country is led by people with a dark vision of the current moment. That's pretty explicit. Mothers and children trapped in poverty, an education system which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives. We are in an outright war that is expanding and metastasizing. The blame for this nightmare may be placed on a, quote, global power structure that has eroded the underlying spiritual and moral foundations of Christianity.
Okay, beautiful.
Well, the first target here, Craig, it seems pretty obvious, isn't just a political one. It's a political one draped in a specific religious attachment. Yeah,
well, so let's just point out here. So the footnote 1, which I glided over on my first reading of this, but which after our discussion previously, I went back and made a point of looking up. If you go back to the footnote,
sure.
This quote, or the series of quotes, comes from two places. It comes from Trump's inaugural address, and it comes from Steve Bannon. Okay, so
both of these, all of these quotes are from
Bannon and
either
Trump.
Bannon or Trump.
Yeah, and the first part there is Trump's inaugural address. So this is him becoming president. Yeah. So now the question, of course, is, well, why? Okay. Well, my country, obviously, Pinker is an American citizen, so he's referring to the United States.
He's a Canadian.
Are you shitting me?
Yeah, I think he's from Montreal originally.
Why is he saying my country then?
He must have become he must have become American like me. I don't know. I
he's a Harvard.
Originally from Montreal. I thought he was originally from Canada.
Very interesting.
I'll take a look. I'll look it up right now. Go ahead. Keep going, Craig.
Okay. Yeah. But. And then it goes on. Well, okay, I mean, I kind of have to, like, where is he going with it? In the pages that follow, I will show that this bleak assessment of the state of the world is wrong, and not just a little wrong, flat earth wrong, couldn't be more wrong. So
yeah, he's a Canadian. Yeah.
Oh,
keep going.
Weird.
Yeah, he's a Canadian citizen.
But this book is not about the 45th president of the United States and his advisors. That's Bannon. It was conceived some years before Donald Trump announced his candidacy, and I hope it will outlast his administration by many more. Okay, so I think this brings out a couple points here. I don't think he's picking on Trump per se. What he's laying out here is that Trump and Bannon and people who think the way that they do, they are not the problems per se. They are symptoms. Okay, and what what Pinker is looking at here, and what the book is about, of course, as we discussed in the previous, our previous meeting, was, the notion of the Enlightenment as a philosophy, or as a kind of, I think of it as an operating system for a civilization.
Yeah.
You've got your hard drive, and you can put whatever the hell you want to on that hard drive, to make it useful. And that's your operating system. And it can be a dysfunctional operating system, or a system that has a lot of bugs and what have you, or it can be an operating system that gives you a lot of power. And the Enlightenment was an operating system that, over the course of roughly 100, 150 years, replaced the sort of religious, mythological, very hierarchical operating system that Christianity and the Middle Ages had been operating with for the better part of 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And so what we are in now, my perspective on this, and clearly what Pinker is outlining here, is that, and what Pinker actually says about the Enlightenment, as a phenomenon, is that there are always countervailing forces. And those countervailing forces sometimes, they wax and wane like everything else. At one time, the Enlightenment itself was a countervailing force. It was something that was trying to sort of overcome, or was working against at the time,
the reigning system of
the ruling system, what was in place. And then eventually, by the mid 1800s, at the latest, the Enlightenment had thoroughly replaced the previous system. But that didn't mean that other ways of thinking were not, still present.
World War II, Hitler and
all of those.
Stalin, those are anti-Enlightenment forces in play as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, there are people who associate them with the Enlightenment. That would be an interesting argument, but it's one that I think is thoroughly debunked.
Well, and I would argue that when you have people like Trump or Putin, or you could even say the whole Brexit phenomenon.
Yeah.
These are slides back towards tribalism, as opposed to the human universalism, which is a hallmark of the Enlightenment.
Craig, I can add something here that might be helpful to you and the listener. I don't know. Is these two paragraphs fit nicely into the context that he set up with his previous book.
I haven't read that.
So let me just try and frame that. It'll take a few seconds, and maybe that'll be helpful. I don't know. Right at the beginning, the first sentence, he says, the second half of the second decade of the third millennium would not seem to be an auspicious time to publish a book on the historical sweep of progress and its causes. So what he's trying to suggest here, if you compare to Better Angels of Our Nature, what he's arguing in Better Angels of Our Nature, which preceded this book, is that it might seem like, if you watch the news, it might seem like if you listen to this party and this party,
serious lack of progress,
things are falling apart, that the world is just decimated by death and mayhem. Whereas what he shows historically is, there's no case for that. The world is increasingly safer. It's the best time to be alive. There's good reason to feel better about life now than 300 years ago. And if you want to go back 300 years, and you would be an idiot.
You'd be a fool to do so.
You'd be a fool. So he's saying here that the way that the political system has set itself up right now is one in which it's saying there's a decline happening. Whereas he, by the end of this second paragraph, is saying, I'm going to tell you a different story, one in which what is actually true is going to come to the forefront, which is there is a progression happening in spite of this kind of retraction to old models, like the foundations of Christianity, and just the fear mongering that's happening there. He's trying to unwind that by facts and by evidence and by reason.
So a couple of analogies come up here. One is financial. So if you know something about the history of the stock market, you will, if you look at the S&P 500 of the Dow going back 100 years or so, you will see a massive, massive increase in, well, the chart just goes up. And what that is corporate profits. That's, well, ultimately it's the value of companies, the aggregate, value of the companies that make up the market. However, you still hear the same panic every time there is a market drop, like what we had in the early part of this year, or what happened in 2007. The sky is falling. You had the same thing happen in the year 2000 with the implosion of the dot-com bubble bust. So what happens is that people tend to be very short-sighted, and I think that this is one of the real bugs of human nature, is that we tend to be focused on survival. Most human beings are just de facto in survival mode, and so they tend to look at short-term things because that tends to be what kills you. It's okay if we die in the long run. We just don't want to die in the short run.
Right.
And so we tend to be very focused on events and processes that are happening in our immediate vicinity and the immediate time lengths that we're familiar with, days, weeks, months, maybe. But when it comes to centuries, which is what Pinker is talking about, and if you look at, well, stock market obviously is more short term.
Sure.
Because it doesn't go, we don't really have centuries of data, but
it's a good image to.
It's an excellent image, because if you look at the upward trajectory, it's wonderful. But if you look at those hairy, scary drops, it can be very frightening when those happen. But they're less frightening when you look at the long-term trajectory. So that's what Pinker is saying, is that, World War I was a massive hiccup. And it basically sabotaged, it basically made a whole generation, the lost generation, a bunch of depressives. And then they didn't get over their depression before they had another hiccup, even bigger, on their hands, which was, the rise of fascism and, communism and what have you.
It's interesting that you're saying this, because the metaphor, the rise of this, it's upward, but the idea is that it's like this, right?
Absolutely.
So maybe he's basically saying, well, I'm going to place this downward slope in a historical context.
Exactly.
Progression.
Going up,
And there's an Enlightenment notion that drives that image, which
progress
comes from Hegel, which is Hegel was foundational, because what he did was he was able to make the past one that was a spiritual history unfolding towards the final judgment with Jesus at the end in Western civilization, with Jesus as a judge and heaven and all of that. It was an eschatological trajectory that history was being understood within that context. Whereas Hegel came along and said, no, we're gonna see this in the context of an event in the human realm of progression. So the idea is you have thesis, the idea comes up, somebody comes along with the antithesis, and then there's somebody else who comes along with a synthesis. The synthesis is a new thesis, then you have the antithesis and the synthesis. And along the way, there's a weeding out of the garbage along the way. So there's a cleanliness process, a cleaning out of bad ideas from the good and separating out the wheat from the chaff kind of thing over time. And that thesis, antithesis, synthesis process is the dialectics. So basically what he's saying here is we are in a process of dialectical progression, where there's an up and a down, and there's an antithesis anytime there's a new thesis that comes along. It has its day, and then somebody comes along and goes, well, what are the good things about the antithesis, and gets rid of the rest, right? Or at least hypothetically, that's the model. So he's
to bring in another analogy, then, essentially, to bring Hegel's language down to a little bit more common way of talking, history is an argument, essentially.
History is an argument.
Yeah, and
it's
so you've got lots of
an exchange of ideas in which there's a battle between a thesis. Somebody comes up with one idea, somebody else, and it has its day, and then somebody rejects it and they have their day, and then somebody else comes along and figures out how to make those work together somehow, and then that's the new thesis, and then there's an argument against it, right? And That's how progress works. That's the historical underbelly that is the
So
Enlightenment.
essentially, we've been living now since, let's say, 1700, 1750, in a world where the thesis is Enlightenment inspired. And actually, it was kind of funny because coming back from my hike with my wife this afternoon in the car, well, when Trump comes up, there's always, a little bit of outrage and what have you, irateness on my part, because, Trump, of course, likes to talk up his game as being a great, promoter of America. And in fact, I view Trump as being entirely anti-American.
Yeah, he's
it's profoundly anti-American. If you know anything about the founding fathers, for all their faults and foibles, I know they were slave owners, blah blah blah, and everything, but the ideas they were quite consciously engaging in an experiment. They knew that it was a political, social, and religious experiment where they were trying to take all the guys, Descartes and Locke and Rousseau, and they were trying to take all these guys and the lessons that they had learned from them and put them together into a working system that could actually be used to govern human beings.
Yeah.
And that had not been done before.
No.
And so that is literally, the United States is inconceivable without the notion of the Enlightenment. And so
it is the Enlightenment project. It
is an Enlightenment project writ large in the body of 13 colonies that became a continent-spanning nation. And this first paragraph here is basically quotes from people whose careers are in effect repudiations of that Enlightenment vision that Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, Franklin, etc., all had.
I agree.
And so
can I add one more thing?
Go for it.
So it seems like what we're talking about here, when I brought up the Hegel thing, that's just naming the process of history that was for the first time understood in the Enlightenment.
And let me interject. If I'm correct in understanding Hegel, Hegel was primarily secular in his thinking, correct? He didn't
sort of. I mean, he was a religious. He was.
I'm not saying that he was not religious into it, but his philosophical vision of history was not.
I'll tell you what's
predicated upon Jesus coming to save us and all.
No, but I'll tell you exactly. Yes, that's correct. But
okay.
I'll tell you exactly why it's secular. Not because he didn't understand. He saw history as the unfolding of spirit. So he had a religious kind of connotation to it. However, you don't need any Christian theology.
Exactly.
Where he's going. So what happened is with the Enlightenment, prior to that, the way history was understood is that the golden age was always in the past. This was true for the Greeks as well as the Christians. So they were very friendly in their way of thinking about history, because you're getting, as time goes by, you're getting farther and farther from the origin story in the Garden of Eden, where you're at bliss with God.
Which is why everything's going to hell in a handbasket.
That's right. So everything, there's a depletion, there's a deflationary history. That's how history was understood. With the Enlightenment, what happened was,
it's the reverse.
If you picture my eyes facing backwards to the past, that's the way I understood history. And you walked forward, imitating the ideals like Jesus and others who were the perfect person in the past. So you went forward by looking to them to tell you how to get forward. What the Enlightenment did is say, no, now you can trust your own reason, your own senses to tell you the truth. You don't need the authorities of the past. And you can turn your back on history, and now your orientation is forward thinking. And that's where the idea of progress comes from, turning the back on those ideals of the past that we saw as necessary for us to be guided by. And no longer did we need to be guided by authorities, priests, kings. We could trust our own minds. And that's what's super radical.
Can you see my page here, my drawing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's blow it up here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is really probably not coming in very well.
What do you got
Anyway,
on there, Craig?
okay, what I've got here essentially is the religious view of history. We
Right.
start off wonderful and everything just goes down.
Right.
The Enlightenment view of history is the past was shit. Life was, brutish. What was it? Hobbes,
Nasty and short.
nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
And now we're getting better. So
Yes.
two diametrically opposed views
That's right.
of not only
The-
history, but of human nature and what's possible.
The Christian one, though, I would just add, is more Dante-esque. It's more the idea.
Well, I know
that
at the end, it's all going to go wonderful when
it's
Jesus.
going to go. It's going to go
Yeah.
up. It's a
Right,
comedy, right? Where at the end you end up in heaven in a
Right,
marriage with,
sure.
with the Lamb of God, right?
But we're not there yet. So
No.
as of now, this is the way
People are
it
getting
goes.
worse.
Yeah.
people are
Everything is getting worse until the apocalypse comes upon us.
That's right.
But so these two worldviews are completely antithetical, which is why Trump wants to make America great again.
Right.
Notice that it's always looking backwards. And like Ronald Reagan, what was Ronald Reagan's view of the world? Always wanted to go back to the 1950s when he was a
Yeah.
cowboy. So
Yeah, and when you do that, you put your people into a bit of a crisis for what it means about the future. Right?
well, we know that everything, unless we can duplicate in some way the future, which is the past, which is obviously not possible, you're always going to be disintegrating, and it's just the forces of darkness, at your lap.
But if you believe that the way things are going, if you're looking to the future, and if you can convince people, like these quotes do from Trump and Bannon,
Yeah.
what they're doing is they're making it look as if the future is horrible, whereas the evidence is not there to justify that, right? And that is where Pinker is saying, nope, you're off. That's not a legitimate claim.
Well, so if I can be charitable to Trump and Bannon, which I'm not generally inclined to be, we could say that their problem is not one of that they're bad people or anything like that, but that they're overly fixated on certain types of problems happening in the present. That is.
Well, I think that what they're doing is they're exploiting.
No. But what I'm saying here is that a lot of people who vote for Trump, I think the issue here is, imagine again my financial metaphor here. Imagine you've got this big portfolio and you're day trading or whatever the hell it is, and then suddenly, for whatever reason, the stock market is falling off a cliff. Oh my gosh, your portfolio has now been cut in half.
Right.
You got to sell your car. Your children are, you can't put them through college anymore. So truly, the world is much worse off. And how can it do anything but get worse? Because now you have to mortgage your house, and you're going to be out on the street, blah blah blah. But if you do have that longer term perspective, you know that typically these things tend to bounce back, and that, hey, the people who will buy value stocks will jump in there and pick them up, and then the value will go back up.
Yeah.
And this is why people who buy high and sell low, they end up losing their shirt. The people who, buy low and hang on, even though there are those drops, will continue to make money in the market. So, like I said, trying to be charitable to people like Trump and Bannon,
Sure.
They're overly fixated on that short-term drop, that short-term crisis, and they don't see the big long-term
I think there's a
perspective.
vision. I think there are some visions underneath this of a future, but one in which power is distributed differently. I do think there's a fantasy underneath Bannon's orientation to decimate democracy itself and elevate the status of centralized authority, like create a system in which there is more centralized authority. And so there is a kind
that's clearly the Republicans' agenda these days.
It seems to
the executive branch.
And Trump, of course, doesn't care. He fits that mold perfectly, only because that's his personality, not because he necessarily knows what the hell he's doing to get there. He just,
Thank God.
He plays into that model perfectly. So let's so if we take it back to the text, I think what he's doing here is trying to say that he's putting himself in a contest that he started. He's saying, I didn't write this book with Donald Trump in mind,
Right, right.
but it just so happens that the arguments that this current administration are making are antithetical to the arguments that I'm going to make, that I think are grounded more soundly in fact and modeled after ideas that are really American. Right. And I think it's interesting that he is a Canadian, because I, as a Canadian, feel like once I understood American history, I was like, this country has to make it, man. It has to make it, because what's great about the world, what I like about the world, has its foundations in ideas that made the country, happen in the first place.
Well, so riffing on the whole American project, the Europeans, of course, post-World War II, kind of got their own project going. They realized that their civilization was not viable if every 20 or 30 years they had one of these massive wars. And so
right.
therefore was the birth of the EU. And it's not, I think, unsurprising that just the time we have the percolating of people like Trump and Bannon, that we then have 51% of Britons who were original founding members, correct me if I'm wrong, at least going back, I don't know when they joined. Well, of course, it was the European community back in the 60s and all, but I can't remember the exact.
I mean, I think they were creating themselves there to be able to compete with the U.S. It wasn't super benign. It wasn't just, let's create.
Well, no, it was.
They also were able to compete that way with the United. They became a kind of United States.
Well, no. Specifically, that was an economic community. They weren't trying to do a political union. So.
No, but what I mean is to compete with the U.S. They formed.
Well, there may well have been part of that, but
capitalist.
They also knew that to minimize the kind of competition that in the past had blown up into great power rivalry, they wanted to knit the economies together better, and that would.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, that would help out everyone. So,
well, I'm making a correlation here between the idea that each individual country after the U.S. emerged would have a hard time competing in the marketplace unless there was an arrangement that was similar to what the states had done, 100 whatever years earlier, in which they formed a kind of centralized system. Now, of course, it wasn't a political system, like you said. I agree with that. But a monetary system. They were trying to come up with the same money, same coinage.
Right. That goes back to
and to support each other, right? I mean, Greece hasn't actually, been a super lucrative element of this group, but they've tried to support Greece along the way, right?
Well, but to that point, though, the United States has the same thing. There are some states that receive far more federal funding than they.
That's right. That's what I'm saying. So there is a kind of metaphor there, and it has made Europe more central to the world than it would have been if each country was.
Yeah, of course. But I do.
That's
think
where I see it competing against the U.S.
That is their sort of version of the point. That was the point that I was trying to make, is that the EU has kind of become their own enlightenment project.
That's right. Yeah.
The values of the EU now, I mean, it's actually written in their constitution. And so now Poland and Hungary are coming under real scrutiny because they have these quite regressive regimes now in place where they are stacking the courts. They are, clearly taking measures that are anti-democratic, that are out of the, the spirit of what Europe has supposed to have been for the past, 40 years.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Do you want to read that last paragraph, Craig?
Yeah, sure. In the pages that follow, I will show that this bleak assessment of the state of the world is wrong, and not just a little wrong, flat earth wrong, couldn't be more wrong. But this book is not about the 45th president of the United States and his advisors. It was conceived some years before Donald Trump announced his candidacy, and I hope it will outlast his administration by many more. The ideas that prepared the ground for his election are, in fact, widely shared among intellectuals and lay people. That's important. On both the left and the right. They include pessimism about the way the world is heading, cynicism about the institutions of modernity, and an inability to conceive of a higher purpose in anything other than religion. And notice you underline that. I will present a different understanding of the world, grounded in fact and inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment, reason, science, humanism, and progress. Enlightenment ideals, I hope to show, are timeless, but they have never been more relevant than they are right now. And of course, those 4 points are the 4 points that he really starts kind of
That's right.
into and outlining it. Well, not in the first chapter, but in that section that you and I started on.
Yeah, and then he expands on that, blows it up.
Right, and those become the templates for the chapters to come.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So do you want to kind of kick into the last section of part? I think that.
So what we did last time is we zoomed through. I don't have it up here. The paragraph.
Oh goodness! Wow.
Page 3.
Yeah. So we were the Enlightenment ideals of the Enlightenment are products of human reason. Blah blah blah.
Here, I can tell you exactly where we went because I got it written down here. When we looked at that paragraph on the previous page that's not on here, page 3, there were 5 items. We moved from reason all the way through sympathy and the layers of connection between them, layers of meaning, so that reason and sympathy became sufficient to provide us with a meaningful life, a rich life, and a rewarding life, and that through these things we are better and more likely to flourish than we would be using other models of faith, dogma, etc.
It's a better operating system.
It's a better operating system. Yeah, it's a better technology. It's sort of like comparing an abacus to a calculator in his mind.
Well, and also just to briefly check back again to where we started on this today is that even as the United States is inconceivable without understanding the Enlightenment ideals, most of what we consider modern technology and the comforts of our civilization would never have happened without the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, science and the Enlightenment. If the Enlightenment is the theory, science is the practice.
Yeah, it's the methodological.
It's the methodology. So I really think that that's worth restating. The Enlightenment ideals are sort of the philosophical underpinning.
So reason, I think he includes under reason things like parsimony. Like reason is parsimonious, meaning that it's modest in its willingness to accept things as true without sufficient.
Well, I think you're kind of getting a little bit ahead of us now.
Yeah, maybe, but what I'm saying is for him, the reason is the vehicle under which we are best capable of moving quickly ahead.
Yeah, but parsimony is, I would say, like a specific aspect of reason. It's sort of a constituent of reason. Would you?
Sure. Yeah.
So given what you just outlined about those points that we sort of drew out of his first paragraph, then we came up to the fact that the Enlightenment does give rise in large numbers of people to existential angst and cynicism about Enlightenment-inspired institutions that are securing the progress. There's always this sort of blowback. I think that's a good term, actually, for this. There's always a blowback against this project because, not everyone wants to give up their little toys and baubles and what have you.
I agree. Do you want me to work through some of the text here so you can get into the thick of it a bit?
Well, okay. So I think the section we were going to pick up with was the ideals of the Enlightenment are products, and you've got.
Yes. Could we? Is it okay if we just step back a little bit to address?
Yeah. Where do you want to?
Some of the. Just let me take a look here, right here. If you can see right where I'm kind of highlighting.
Yeah, sure. Area. I hope this is all coming up on the Zoom thing.
Sorry. The Enlightenment principle that. The Enlightenment principle that we can apply reason and sympathy to enhance human flourishing may seem obvious, trite, old-fashioned. I wrote this book because I've come to realize that it is not, right? More than ever, the ideals of reason, science, humanism, and progress need a wholehearted defense.
Yeah.
Why? And then what he does is he says, it's in the years since I took the young woman's question, I have often been reminded of the need to restate the ideals of the Enlightenment, also called humanism, the open society, and cosmopolitan or classical liberalism, It is not just that questions like hers regularly appear in my inbox. And
I
he gives
love
an example of something
this one's
different,
great.
of a common question that he gets from other people. Dear Professor Pinker, what advice do you have for someone who has taken ideas in your books and science to heart and sees himself as a collection of atoms, a machine with a limited scope of intelligence, sprung out of selfish genes inhabiting space-time? So he's trying to solve something that a lot of people who have left behind faith and religion and the afterlife as the center of attention, and are now concerned about this life as a center of attention, have a new kind of anxiety
Yeah.
to deal with, right? And so there you go, and I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, well, so where are we? Okay, yeah. So we pointed out, so existential angst and cynicism about the Enlightenment-inspired institution. So what you just read is an example of existential angst. So
That's right.
there are people who, that transition to a sort of faith-based model, where I'm basically told what the meaning of my life is and how it's all going to end and where we all go and all that stuff. It's all set out for me. I just have to read the right books, or listen to the right, pastor or whoever it is. But the problem with the Enlightenment, of course, is it pulls that rug out from under you, and now you have to kind of come up with your own responses. And unfortunately,
That's right. You're on your own.
if we grow up, always being told, what to think, and then we are suddenly in a situation where we have to start doing our own thinking, that's uncomfortable. And, it's like one thing I've noticed, and you've taught writing yourself, is that our school system doesn't really teach young people how to write coherently very well. So just writing a simple argumentative essay is very, very challenging. And I think it actually that's symptomatic of a deeper problem, which is that people don't really learn how to think with a lot of clarity. That is to ask the right questions, to be skeptical and to be comfortable with skepticism, and then to just actively seek answers. So I think that is a part of the existential angst thing. We've kind of created a civilization where that skill is not really, I'm not saying it's not there. I'm not saying it's not taught at all, but it's not, a lot of people seem to not pick up that skill very effectively.
I think it could be on center stage, certainly a lot more than it is.
Yeah. And then the other aspect here, so cynicism about Enlightenment-inspired institutions, he didn't go into as much here, but just from what I'm observing, and we can kind of riff a little bit on this, I think. You look at, okay, well, no, here's an interesting point. So, right now, American trust in government, what is the popularity of Congress, or the trust in Congress? It's like, single digits. I think the presidency has maybe a little bit more esteem, left to it. And the Supreme Court of the judiciary is probably the most respected, organ of government at this point. But right now, even that is being heavily politicized. And so I suspect, and some of the commentators I've heard, that even that is going down. And so at a certain point, you have to kind of wonder, like, well, what institutions are respected? And we've got a significant portion of the population that still thinks the world is 6,000 years old. So clearly, science as a project is, I don't know what the level of respect of science is as a whole, because even the understanding of it is pretty marginal. If you're a fundamentalist, then clearly you're not getting science. You're not on board with that project.
No.
So
not.
all of these things are, quote, Enlightenment-inspired institutions. I mean, there are others as well, but these are some that quickly come to mind. And they're under assault, or they've never really been fully bought into. There's if you're a fundamentalist or sort of leaning that direction, then you never really bought into the Enlightenment project, I would argue.
Right.
Yeah, and so skepticism obviously is going to be, or cynicism is going to be.
No, yeah, not skepticism for sure, but yeah, cynicism.
Yeah, cynicism. So people will just not trust. They'll have a problem parsing out what are real bona fide sources of information. So, for example, if you talk to somebody in the street, what is their thought about X, Y, or Z, then chances are they're going to come at that question with whatever, news, could be CNN or it could be MSNBC. If they're on the left, if they're more on the right, it could be Fox or, God forbid, Breitbart. But, it really doesn't take a lot of effort, I would say, to figure out better sources of information. You can do a little bit of research to find places that are not quite so partisan. I mean, any place is going to be subject to the occasional error, of course. I mean, human beings are writing, these articles and what have you, but nonetheless, you can come up with, reasonable opinions on things by looking at a variety of sources, reading books or, reading magazine articles. The Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal. Interestingly enough, Wall Street Journal has, I would say, terrible editorial, but their reporting is fantastic. You can look at, reporting from other countries, BBC or maybe someplace in Asia or whatever. In other words, it's possible to get a more variety in one's news diet. But then, of course, that's just sort of on the surface. To actually understand the world, you have to read history. You got to read intellectual history, philosophy, perhaps, but I've been blabbing for a bit here. So
yeah, so okay, so one of the things that we might want to address here is after this quote from a student, he talks about, what is it that is problematic about what the student is saying? What, if you notice my note there, I wrote, this is.
Yeah, I couldn't read that. What is that saying?
It says this is about to be debunked.
Oh.
So the point of this is to say this kid, whoever said this, is describing a universe that is not the one the Enlightenment is describing at all. It's actually misses the point. It says some things that are reasonable, but it leads to an obviously cynical worldview, because it's selfish is the key word there. This word cynical, the history of the word cynical, or the concept, comes from the idea that anytime something happens, you can interpret it through the lens of what was the self-interest or what was the selfish intent behind it all, that there's nothing that has any generosity to it.
That's the source of the term cynic?
A cynic is somebody who sees selfishness in everything that's happening. And so he's saying, I'm going to debunk this. It's not just that cynics are negative. If it was accurate, then he would be a cynic as well. What he's saying is it's actually just, it's inaccurate. It's not what the Enlightenment.
Well, it's only looking at a very small aspect of reality. Yes, there's plenty of selfishness out there, but there's also lots of generosity and benevolence. And
even if those things are self-interested, the Enlightenment makes a distinction between selfishness and self-interest. Self-interest is not morally problematic in the Enlightenment.
Well, and here's where I like the term enlightened self-interest. So if I were, king of the United States, the whole America First project that is espoused by Trump, I think is a doomed project, but that doesn't mean that one can't exercise enlightened self-interest. And enlightened self-interest, I would argue, would require you to build strong alliances to help out your friends when they are in need. The Marshall Plan, the United States basically helped to rebuild at great expense Europe. Well, you could say, well, that was for selfish motives. Well, yeah, sure it was, but it also had there was a lot of benevolence and foresight behind that, and look what it did. It made both sides
the Enlightenment was came out of what came out of the Enlightenment morally was utilitarianism. It's not a super awesome name, but it's really just the idea that the goal of all morality and all ethics and all legal systems is the well-being of conscious
of the
creatures,
most,
right?
the most
Of the
possible.
most, yeah. And so what he's saying is the ideals of the Enlightenment here, just to quote what he's saying, the ideals of the Enlightenment are products of human reason, but they always struggle with other strands of human nature, which is what you were addressing. And
Yeah,
here's
this
what
is
he
about where we
sees
left
as,
off, I think, last time.
and here's where what he says are the list of items that the categories that represent the strands of human nature that are resistant to this.
So
Loyalty to
these are
tribe,
basically anti-enlightenment principles.
loyalty to tribe, deference to authority, magical thinking, the blaming of misfortune on evildoers. So to summarize, what
Beautiful.
loyalty to tribe does is loyalty to me is akin to faith, being faithful in religion, where you cling to it even when it doesn't necessarily produce desirable results.
My country, right or wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Deference to authority, again,
Authoritarianism.
right? Magical thinking, and the blaming of misfortune on evildoers, which is an interesting one, the relocation of blame on others. So that's what I was getting at last.
So that's the failure to take responsibility.
That's what I was talking about last time when I had said that we've moved from what the Enlightenment would see as a culture of critique to a culture of complaint.
Yeah. I mean, I could take any one of these and so fast go down the rabbit hole of political, just political stuff that's going on nowadays. There's so many examples of each of these. And I'll give you very quickly a grotesque example of magical thinking that just jumped out at me this morning. Okay, so of course, what was it, yesterday, day before yesterday, we got Trump's diagnosis with COVID. And, one of the thoughts that was immediately expressed basically internationally, I mean, this was worldwide, people were suddenly saying, well, maybe now his followers would start taking the pandemic seriously. Because I have still been encountering, not my boss, but the boss of our department is a Trump supporter. And she actually routinely will dismiss, like, people are still concerned about this. She will say that in private, say things like that in private. So in other words, she still, even at this point, as of last week, does not take the pandemic seriously. And so, the assumption was that, well, okay, now their dear leader has gotten the bug, and maybe now they will start wearing masks, realizing this is all for real. No. So this morning, I open up the news. I forget what website it was. I think it was AP News or Reuters. And what do I see? In his stead, his supporters are having rallies. And what are they? And it shows pictures of them in the rallies. Not a single one of them are wearing a mask.
Yeah, no.
In other words, the magical thinking here is that somehow we are special. We are immune.
But I think that underneath that too is, again, loyalty, right? It's actually the way that you show it's like a love relationship. When you love somebody,
personality cult.
When you love somebody, what's the best way to demonstrate that love in the face of some adversity or something they've done? In the face of adversity or something they've done wrong, is to try to demonstrate your love in the face of that lack of love from the other person. That's really, really how you show your love. And so the loyalty is part of the magical thinking. And then locating blame outside of the self is a way to, it's a modern version of absolution. It's just a modern technique for absolving the self of responsibility. It's a sort of spiritual greed, if you will.
So then what you're saying, Chad, is that essentially all of these strands work together. They're like four cords that make the rope much stronger, and they don't operate independently.
No, that's right.
So the loyalty to the tribe, the deference to authority, and if you read about any of the authoritarian, the long-lasting, or even like Nazis, these really powerful authoritarian regimes, all of them were filled with this magical thinking. Like I mean, the Hitler's, the German Volk as being the special, they were literally like the chosen race. I mean, the Aryan special race and what have you. That's
What science does, though, even there, is it puts you in the position of having to accept your actual place in the universe rather than denying it by pretending you have a special place in the universe, which is
what were you saying? What does that? Enlightenment thinking?
science does
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
because
Well,
it
it forces
places
you
you
to
in,
deal with the reality of your
it
limits.
it makes it clear that you're in a position that's very small within the universe, and your relevance is precarious and is not really that different than anybody else's in the planet. And so it the Enlightenment, what it did that's scary
But
is
that's why it's so uncomfortable.
what
You can see immediately right there why that's so uncomfortable to so many people.
right what freaks people out about the Enlightenment is that it continually expands the scope of who is included within the human category, right? So nations don't work anymore. Cultures don't work anymore. Your history doesn't work anymore as an indicator of identity, because now science has exposed that we are genetically almost identical. We are irrelevant to the universe as a whole. Nobody has a special place in it. I mean, you read the Bible and your 6 or 7-year-old child knows more about their place in the universe than the authors of the Bible, right, ever did.
I sure did.
Nowadays. Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, so not to say there wasn't intelligence there, but in some cases, but ignorance, right? And so loyalty to tribe doesn't make sense in that context at all. Deference to authority, why? Unless you want the authority to beat up those of your enemies who are not in your tribe, there's no reason to trust some authority outside of your own thinking. And magical thinking obviously is associated with that, and blaming others is the key, I think.
Can
all
I?
of this, it's
You were
responsible.
you were just mentioning about the expansion even beyond like beyond obviously the tribe and to race and then the whole of the human, you know.
And then the world
Well,
itself,
that's
right? Every
where I
other
was
living
going.
thing,
Is
right?
even
So
in other species too. Do you remember
yeah.
that? I think I told you about this story that I had where because I really feel very, very strongly that we need to be in a mindset where we acknowledge the personhood of other species. You know, the great apes, certainly, I would say elephants, whales, and what have you. But this is obviously, to some people, they just can't even go there. And so when we got our cat, Morphe, who we've now had for, what is it now? Geez, 10 years? 9 years. When we first got him, we had been living with him for like a few months, and we took a vote. There were 4 of us, and the question up for debate was: is Morphe a person? And it was a very interesting question, and we voted 4-0 that he was a person.
Sure.
And I mentioned this to a colleague at work, and she is a devout Christian.
Yeah.
I don't think she's fundamentalist, but she may be kind of teetering in that direction. And when I told her this, she was visibly disturbed. It was obvious. She didn't say anything, because to say something would have been very just patently, confrontational or aggressive. But it was clear that this decision on our part was offensive or disturbing or disorienting to her.
Oh, it's a deep part of our culture, Craig, to dismiss this. Yeah.
But that whole notion of tribe, when you do away with it, really truly do away with it, then only then is the kind of thing that the conclusion we came to, that other beings have their own personhood. It may not be as expansive and as, obviously, foresighted or whatever, or feeling a kind of personhood as we have, as humans have, but nonetheless, that they must be acknowledged as, beings with, their own desires and intentions. And again, that's not even conceivable before the
Well,
enlightenment.
see, if your expectation is that you are a soul, an eternal soul, and other things are not, your expectation in life exceeds the evidence, right? And so just to be subtle, and so the problem is like, for example, and this is deeply ingrained in our society somehow. So if I tell my kids, if I tell the girls, remind them that we're animals, they laugh. And then they're like, oh yeah, I guess we are, right? When they think about it factually and they slow down for a second, but their initial impulse is to laugh. Yeah, right. We're not animals. And because of the association that we have with animals, and
Right.
yet what we are
They
animals.
poop wherever they want
We
to.
like to exclude ourselves from that category somehow, because of technology or our intelligence or relative intelligence or whatever. And it's that way of identifying the self, that self-affirmation system, is anti-enlightenment at
Yeah.
its core.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So
So this next paragraph, you want to move to this next paragraph?
yeah, let's do it. This one is, we talked about a lot of these things last
We
time.
were starting to get into that. That's
We
what
did. We got into this, but I do feel like that because you were not as, you hadn't really immersed yourself in this particular section of the book, that it might be worth talking about again.
Yeah, and actually, if I may read actually my notes.
Yeah.
So this next paragraph, which starts off with "if you still are unsure," etc., etc. The notes that I wrote there were Islamic State versus the West is basically the way that for some people, the way that some people are feeling that right now, that is a sort of certainty versus uncertainty. So the Islamic State is,
Oh, I see. Right.
yeah, they are living with a paradigm of total absolute certainty. And the
That's
West,
the ideal. That's the ideal. Yeah.
yeah, the West seems to be at the other end of uncertainty. And yeah, we are unsure of them. So the West is shy of its values and doesn't speak up for classical liberalism. And so my response to that is that yes, right now there is definitely a crisis of confidence, but my feeling is that the Enlightenment is actually not a way of thinking that exists within this dichotomy.
Say that again.
Okay, so right now, I think what this writer is saying with Shiraz Maher, okay, I think his analysis here, when he talks about the Islamic State, yes, it absolutely knows what it stands for. And yes, I think it is the case that many intellectuals, perhaps in the West, they feel shy speaking up for classical liberalism here. And I think we need to make it clear that classical liberalism here has nothing to do with the Democratic Party or
no.
This is the Enlightenment project. That's what classical liberalism is referring to, is the Enlightenment project. But what I'm saying here, rather long-windedly, is that I don't think that the Enlightenment project is caught within the dichotomy of certainty versus uncertainty. In other words, while fundamentalists of whatever ilk, be they Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or whatever, while they may be existing in a sort of imaginary realm of certainty, I don't think that the Enlightenment project is somewhere in the other end of that bandwidth of uncertainty. I don't think the Enlightenment thinking is about uncertainty. I think that the Enlightenment project is about recognizing the limits of certainty.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah,
let me try to speak to that. That's why I had earlier brought up the idea of parsimony.
Exactly.
Parsimony.
Perfect.
So,
Yes.
so that
Perfect
it was just an attempt to set up the idea that you're not really, you don't have to worry about your convictions don't have to be as extreme in either way.
Right. Right.
The value that is idealized is caution, not indifference or uncertainty, but certainly neither of them, both of them are in effect rejected.
I think that certainty, extreme certainty or extreme uncertainty, are both seriously problematic.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
crippling in a way.
and both epistemologically and ethically. And so in this text, what he's trying to say is, one of the symptoms, in my opinion, of classical liberalism is a sufficient amount of self-doubt not to feel over the need to put yourself out there in a forceful way. And what he's saying is we're competing with other cultures that do idealize certainty.
Yes, yeah.
And see
Well, even within our own
uncertainty,
culture, we've had those people. So
right, and see uncertainty as a weakness, not as a potential strength when something deserves uncertainty.
right.
Right, and so loyalty is really what certainty means here. Certainty, nobody can really logically be certain of anything, but they can be loyal enough to behave as if they are certain, and that's faith, right? I mean, this is what the comparison is here. But he's also suggesting that the West, whatever its values are, I don't really like the whole West-East thing myself.
Yeah, well, it's no longer valid.
I'd prefer to just say, if you're really understanding the Enlightenment, you're going to have to say, well, these are human values, and the origin is secondary to the fact that they were originated with humans.
Well, that's like
wherever the humans are.
There is no, I mean, physics, you could say, well, okay, the English had Newton, and that's sort of where classical physics came from, but physics is not, we don't have English physics versus French physics, or German
or Muslim algebra.
Yeah. These are universal aspects of reality that human beings are picking up on, and that then get communicated from one area of the globe to another. And I would say that there are people in East Asia who are far more on board with the Enlightenment project than some people who voted for Brexit are.
Yeah. Why don't we just read it so that people know what we're talking about?
From where? You mean if you?
Yeah, sure. The whole paragraph. Go
Okay.
for it.
Oh, okay. If you still are unsure whether the ideals of the Enlightenment humanism need a vigorous defense, consider the diagnosis of Shiraz Maher, an analyst of radical Islamist movements. Quote, "The West is shy of its values. It doesn't speak up for classical liberalism," he says. "We are unsure of them. They make us uneasy," end quote. Contrast that with the Islamic State, which, quote, "knows exactly what it stands for, a certainty that is incredibly seductive." That's I would say, the seduction of all fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And he should know, having once been a regional director of the jihadist group Hizb ut-Tahrir. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's something self-explanatory about that, but that's why I think that a good word to connect with Enlightenment methodology is a caution. So caution leads us to non-extremes, right? So I'm not going to jump on board with like abandoning knowledge altogether, and saying we can't know anything just because we can't be certain, right? You can know things and have a sense of the probability of those things being accurate without having to be willing to defend them to the death to show your loyalty to the truth.
Right. Loyalty has nothing to do with this at all, actually.
Well, that's why the idea of the truth as a separate category of pursuit stands out. We moved from a world in which ontology is what mattered, and then the truth was assumed, where who you are is what was already determined before you were born by the truth. The truth was already given. You didn't need to seek it out. So you have to doubt religion in order to break free to a world in which knowledge could become progressive. You could see yourself as getting more knowledge, because in the past, all knowledge was already given by the text, by Jesus, by God. And so everything that you needed was already available. So you have to break with that in order to have a progressive sense of knowledge and truth. And
so essentially what needs to happen,
and it's very threatening.
You blanked out a little bit there. Sorry if I spoke over you there. So essentially,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, what goes on down there below. The next paragraph, the last sentence there, the underlying ideas may be as valid as ever, referring to the ideas of the Enlightenment, but the words, even when they refer to problems that are still with us, no longer convey the same conviction. And that is a quote from Friedrich Hayek, who was a German economist. And I wrote a little note there in the margin, and I basically said the need of basically the need of the Enlightenment to constantly re-express itself. So you can't rest on your laurels in a sense, in terms of how you
That's right.
teach these things, how you practice these things. But to kind of come back to what you were just saying, I think here what we really have is it's a chronic and ongoing conflict or friction between people who are more of a skeptical nature and people who are of a more trusting or believing nature. And my wife, I mean, who you know, she is a sort of dyed-in-the-wool skeptic. And actually, when I was, so even though she grew up in South Korea, and her family were all Buddhist, she just didn't buy any of it. She didn't see any value in any of it. And weirdly enough, she didn't actually start to take any interest in Buddhism until she encountered me. And then I'm like, take a look at this. And she was like, oh, this is much more reasonable than I had been led to believe. But the reason it was reasonable, kind of weirdly enough, was because it wasn't force-fed to her as something that she had to believe. It was something that she could actually do an experiment with and test out, which is more to the original spirit of, you know, what the Buddha, the man, what he was getting at. Unfortunately, like so many of these things, as they percolate down the centuries and millennia, they become stodgy ideologies. And then when you are born into a culture that has this stodgy ideology, which is what Buddhism became, you know, it's just one more thing to believe. It's no different than believing in the Trinity. You know, what's the evidence for this?
So I think
Yeah.
what you're getting at there is something I remember when the walls came down in Germany, and we had some relatives who came for the first time out of Eastern Germany to visit Canada. And I wasn't there, but I was told the story.
These are relatives of
that
yours,
took
Chad?
this relatives of ours.
Wow.
I didn't know them. They were, to me, it felt like they were distant relatives. I don't know how close they were, but on my mother's side,
That's so cool that you actually had relatives who were on the other side, huh?
yeah, who my family on my mother's side had never seen before.
Wow.
And when they apparently, the story goes, they came to Canada and for a visit. And the story I heard was when they walked into, like, you know, a Costco or a huge
Walmart
store, and they literally apparently broke out into tears, like it was overwhelming. And part of their reaction was that, I mean, here we are. To me, what stood out was I kept thinking, well, here I'm walking around complaining that they don't have cherry Coke. They only have one. I only have one option of Coca-Cola, not 7 of them.
Yeah.
Right. And that really was pissing me off that day.
But that's all in your head, though.
And then I hear that story and I think, okay, what a weird complaint. They'd never seen anything like this before. It was blowing their minds to the degree that they were crying, like they were overwhelmed with, because they had been told so many other things, that the world we were in was not X, Y, or Z. They had been lied to, and they had been misunderstood. And the world they were in, they'd go to the store and there were 5 loaves of bread left by noon, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's what you're getting at is the value of studying history, so that you can place yourself into your current context, feeling like a foreigner to it sufficiently to realize which things are really valuable and which defending. Otherwise, they just feel natural, like you don't need to defend them.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what you're getting at here. Is these ideas may sound old, but they are worth defending. They make your life better in a way that is worth fighting for.
Yeah, and so I mean, I've often thought that if there was one, you know, if there's one quote liberal art that I think it's every bit as important as the sciences, the math, you know, the STEM things. It's history. Yeah, people who don't have sufficient grounding in history, and not just the history of their own culture, but preferably the history of other cultures as well, they are unmoored in effect.
Yeah.
They don't have a perspective on their own world, and it's very hard. I mean, what did the Khmer Rouge do the moment they took over? Well, they declared that year was the year zero, i.e., there is no history.
Right.
They erased history,
Right.
and
Yeah.
that's what all authoritarian regimes do.
Yeah.
Or we're now duplicating what was 2,000
That's a
years
good
ago,
point.
back in the golden age, and now we're going to do that now. But any real sense of what history is, or your current context, is simply not allowed. It's heretical.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that I view that as just really, really critical. And then, of course, the ability to travel. You when an introduction, you said all these countries that you had traveled in and you had taught in, and I spent almost a decade of my life living in, well, 3 other countries: Japan, South Korea, and Sri Lanka. And I came back from that, and I realized I forget where it was, but it was some point along the way where I finally understood what it meant to be an American. And I didn't really know it before then. It took me being outside of the country to realize the sort of unique aspects of the mentality and the way of looking at things, and the experiences I had had, and the expectations I had, and how those things defined me as coming from a unique culture and background, where I'm a product of that unique background. And then I was placed in these very different environments, literally, like, I was living for a while completely out in the sticks in Sri Lanka. I think some of those people thought the world was flat, I'm sure of it. And then to see myself bumping up against these people, all wonderful people who I came to love, but it's very hard to understand what constitutes your uniqueness, or the nature of your culture, until you've really bumped up against other cultures. And so,
that's a really big deal. I think what we're talking about here is like a principle of being self-reflection.
yeah.
So how, and that is an Enlightenment ideal, is the ideal of being able to get outside of yourself imaginatively in order to be able to see yourself, because you can't do it otherwise. You need
and it's because of the universalizing aspect of Enlightenment thinking. The notion
that's right. Yeah.
The notion that what is familiar is not necessarily better than what is unfamiliar.
That's right.
But because that's not the normal way that we think,
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I remember one of the things about grad school that was important to me was I was in a comparative literature program, and it draws people from all over the world. So I was, I had friends from China, Greece. Like there were very few Americans in my program. Yeah, very few Americans in my program. Well, there's some, but it was a very diverse crowd of people worldwide, an international crowd. And one of the things that disappears in that world is if you want to communicate, you almost have to get rid of your local habits and talk more generally. Like it's almost like you have to get rid of your local tribe.
All your colloquialisms.
You can't use the same idioms freely.
Yeah, well, I experienced that when talking to English speakers in Korea or Sri Lanka. I couldn't talk like an American.
Yeah, well, and also one of the things that I couldn't do was differentiate types of people in the same way they could from the outside. So, for example, it was the opposite. They can't tell the difference between different classes of people like insiders can. So when I'm in the U.S. Or in Canada, you can talk to somebody and you can see these differences of class,
Sure.
how they dress. You're a mod, you're a this, you got all these labels.
Blue collar worker.
Yeah, but then you show that to somebody who's never been to the U.S. from Greece, and they're like, I don't see any difference between any of you people.
Right.
You all seem like you're trying to be different. so you're the same to me.
I had a direct
conclusion a lot of
experience.
them.
I'm sorry, there's a little bit of overlap there. I had a direct experience of that one time, teaching English in Korea. This was in 1993, during Bill Clinton's term. And I made the point, Bill Clinton and I don't talk the same. And they were flummoxed. They were like, what? I'm like, he's from Arkansas. If you look at him, he has a Southern drawl. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. Okay, well, that's of what. So my accent is like this. Like if you watch the average news anchor in America,
they're gonna
sound like them. I have the most standard mode of talking in America.
Right.
Bill Clinton does not have that. This was mind blowing to that class. I'll never forget the looks on their faces.
Yeah, and so they don't, as an outsider, that's a kind of insight you don't get. Like, you think you're really unique within your world, but when you talk to somebody who's from the outside and you discover you're not to them, you see a perspective of yourself. You catch yourself in the act of a little bit of a misunderstanding about how you appear to the world and who you really are, and it's very confronting to have to see yourself from somebody else's perspective. And that's what the Enlightenment requires. That's why globalization is a big part of what the Enlightenment is all about, is the global community. So.
And why the Trumpers, etc., so hate globalism. But
that's right. Absolutely.
One last.
Why don't we close the door here, Craig? Do you want to close the door on this?
No, I do. There's one last little story on
do
identity flipping thing that it's tangential to this, but I had been a number of years in South Korea. Again, this is another experience from 1993, where I was living with Koreans. All my friends were Koreans. My students are Koreans. I had no contact at that point to white people. And one day I'm walking down a street, and I walk by a shop. And the shop had a front door that was open. So it was the door was open to the street. And on that door was a full-length mirror. And so suddenly I was confronted with my full body and face image on the mirror, and I was stunned.
Yeah, why?
I felt suddenly disoriented because I was so used to seeing Korean faces, bodies, style, everything. And then to suddenly see
to yourself.
I had become, in a way, foreign to myself. It was so strange. So this is the kind of, I'm convinced, really, I think this is healthy for people to undergo these identity and paradigm shifts where they understand that they are no more normal or ordinary or de facto or default than anybody else is. In other words, the whole theory of relativity applies everywhere. There is no locus to the universe. Yes, psychologically, the theory of relativity applies.
You can imagine being a Canadian in the U.S. when I first moved there. Sometimes when people would find out that I was a Canadian, they'd feel like I had tricked them.
Oh my God! I think
they would feel like I had tricked them, and I'm like, but I never said I wasn't.
I never said I wasn't.
A Canadian.
I never said I wasn't.
They would feel. Some people would look at me and they would feel suspicious. They would feel uncomfortable, like they didn't feel safe around me anymore because I had tricked them and I was a foreigner. Or like I'd hang out with my friend, a friend of mine whose family's origins are Pakistani. And we go out together. If we were out, I mean, this guy is like, hardcore American Lakers fan. Like, he's just like American.
Is he Pakistani?
American guy. Yeah, I mean, he just happens to have Pakistani parents, but he's American.
Right.
And I'm not, or I wasn't at the time. I hadn't become an American yet. And so we would go out, and everywhere we went, people asked him where he was from, and I was the foreigner. So
that's beautiful. I love it.
It was an insight you can't have unless you have that difference in order to recognize that where your place within the world. You can't achieve it without having
that is the most delicious irony, Chad.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah.
But let's go on.
Okay, so I was thinking here, I just noticed a sentence that just sums it all up, and I think we could close the door very effectively just with the last sentence, full sentence on the page on the right here, page, whatever this is, page 5 of the, whatever it is, it's not an opening chapter. It's just,
Yeah, it's
opening,
between the preface and the first chapter. We've kind of kicked.
yeah, and he doesn't name it. This is what he's after. He doesn't. This isn't the thesis of the book. The thesis is that enlightenment is worth preserving, and that the ideas in the Enlightenment are worth learning, studying, and defending. But he says this book is my attempt
Yeah.
to restate the ideas of the Enlightenment in the language and concepts of the 21st century. So he deals with this issue that you had brought up about that the words seem stuffy now. So we've got to, but the ideas are amazing. So how are we going to salvage them? I'm going to try my best in our world to salvage them by using a language that makes sense to everybody, and that would be appealing. And provide us with the tools to defend a set of ideas that he thinks are worth preserving because the evidence warrants their protection.
Yeah.
Right. And not just for Western humans, but for humans. It's
Yeah.
a human project.
And for cats and great apes.
Is that a fair? Yeah. Is that right? Right. The great ape. Yeah.
All of our brothers and sisters in the animal kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Our fellow human primates and
Yes.
our non-human primates.
Human swimmers in the ocean.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Love
We should do one time. We should do something on evolution. That'd be interesting. Anyways,
Yeah, actually,
thanks,
Chad.
Craig.
So yeah, just to on the next page, I wrote there framework for understanding. That essentially, this is where he's going with the book.
Okay, go for it. Say it. Yeah, there's one sentence there that's really important. Go ahead.
You want me to read that? Okay, yeah. So
Well, the one that stands out to me is when enlightenment has worked.
where is that?
Perhaps the greatest on the next page.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
the
this.
enlightenment has worked. Perhaps the greatest story seldom told.
Oh yeah, I loved it when
That's the
I
punchline.
yeah, well, because there's that movie, the greatest story ever told, or whatever,
Yeah,
which
that's
is
right.
the Bible, and
Yeah.
this is a better story. Trust me, people.
Yeah, this is. Oh, that's a nice way to end it there. Yeah. So
Yeah,
he,
yeah, I didn't- yeah, we need to end it.
in effect as a contest with what we've traditionally seen as the greatest story ever told. There's a new one that doesn't require a God to die on a cross, sacrifice himself to save us from the rules that he created.
Well, and also the greatest story never told, the Enlightenment story, assumes that there are a bunch of adults in the room who can carry the torch forward instead of a bunch of little children who are waiting for the real grown up to show up and then put an end to everything.
Yeah,
That's
right.
the story we've been
Yeah.
fed for the past 2,000 years.
I.e. dictators to
Yeah.
come and save the day.
Cosmic dictators.
Yeah, cosmic dictators.
God, no,
Mafia
we're
boss.
not being political or
The
religious.
mafia boss in the sky. Okay, awesome.
Okay, so yeah, let's
Next time we'll get together and we'll start on chapter
we will
1
nail
and
chapter
we'll go from there.
1. Yes.
Yeah.
With a skewer.
Chapter 1 is called Dare to Understand, and it's about the courage to know in the face of biases and against the wishes that we would have about the universe that contradict reality. So
Okay,
it's pretty
so
great.
I'm just going to go ahead and put an end to our recording here.